get my glasses on so I can see what's happening around me. As we prepare for our class this morning, I'd like for us to take a look at Psalms 10. Psalm 10. I was reading that this morning. It was one of my exercises, and I thought, well, this would be something that would help us. The goal of my class is to help us to appreciate the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And as we are preparing for that particular exercise, we're looking in Genesis, and we're looking at the interaction that God is having with Abraham, and the promise that he's made to him, and the fact that Abraham is growing in his belief of God, that God exists, and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. And of course, we need to believe that God exists and that he did create the world and the universe as he's recorded in Genesis, the first chapter. And the Hebrew letter points out to us in the 11th chapter that that's one of the things that you and I, as believers of God, must accept, is the Genesis account of the creation of the world. God created us. God is involved. We need to come to appreciate that he does exist. And so he's working with Abram and trying to help him with his faith that he does, and that he can believe and have faith in the trust in the things that God is promising him. And of course, we have to have that trust that God is saving us through Jesus, and that as we come to Jesus, we have the forgiveness of our sins. And then as we have the forgiveness of our sins, God is crediting righteousness to us. And so we need to believe that we have heaven, and that's the faith that we need to acquire, need to have. We are heaven-bound, that we are promised to be with God eternally in heaven as we come to him through Jesus, and that he's working these things all out. So I'd like for us to take a look at Psalms chapter 10, reading from the New International Version. I know some of you have a version to that, but I do a lot of my studying out of Psalms, or out of the New International Version. Psalms 10. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In his arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak, who are caught in the schemes of his devices. He boasts of the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. In his pride, the wicked does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. His ways are always prosperous. He is haughty, and your laws are far from him. He sneers at all his enemies. He says to himself, nothing will shake me. I'll always be happy and never have trouble. His mouth is full of curses and lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush, he murders the innocent, watching in secret for his victims. He lies in wait like a lion in cover. He lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed. They collapse. They fall under his strength. He says to himself, God has forgotten. He covers his face and never sees. Isn't that an interesting observation? God covers himself and doesn't want to watch. He hides his face. Verse 12. Arise, Lord. Lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. Why does the wicked man revile God? Why does he say to himself, he won't call me to account? But you, O God, do see trouble and grief. You consider it to take it in hand. The victim commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and evil man. Call him to account for his wickedness, that would not be found out. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his hand. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, in order that man who is of the earth may terrify no more. Very interesting. God exists. God does care. God looks after us. God has promised Abraham that he's going to look after him. We look at chapter 15 and picking it up. We're not going to belabor chapter 15 anymore. We've talked about it quite a bit. But the thing is that God is revealing himself to mankind, and he wants them to believe that he does exist and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. And he's working on Abram, and he's told Abram, I'm going to be with you. I will be with you. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Chapter 15. And so we see that he's pointing out to Abram. Now he wants us to recognize, and this is the point that we've been making, and that is that this is a promise as opposed to a covenant. This is a promise. God is making a promise, and he's promising Abraham that he's going to make of him a great nation. Notice now, let's just read it. Won't belabor it. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. There's your promise. He says, he took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And this is the point in time that Paul's talking about in Romans. This is the faith that Abram had, that God created or credited as righteousness. The nature of that credit or faith and the strength of that faith, we can only suppose and surmise. God also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved, mistreated 400 years, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward They will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And remember, we talked about God demonstrates his existence through signs, wonders, and miracles. And he's also demonstrating his existence and his power to be able to divinely intervene and providentially intervene into our lives and preserve us. And so he's pointing this out to us through a prophecy. And this is one of the ways in which God demonstrates his existence, is through prophecy. And so here he is giving Abraham a prophecy. This is what's going to happen to your descendants. And for his prophecy to come to pass will prove that he does exist. And of course, the way in which it is brought about involves God's divine intervention, providence, and preservation. And so we see that these are the things that are demonstrating his existence in the way he intervenes in yours and my life. Any questions concerning that particular part of it? So he's setting it up to prove that he does exist. But this is obviously a prophecy that falls into the category of a prophecy, so it means that it's going to happen in the future, and then he's giving us the events that are going to evolve around that prophecy itself. So then, remember why he does not give the land to Abraham at this time? Right. And that's where we left off. He says, but the sins have not complete. They are not in their full measure. So that's in verse 16. As we look at verse 16, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sins of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So God has purpose. God has reason. And so here we are. He's giving us a reason why Abraham is not going to get this land like that. There's some things that have to take place, some things that have to, events that have to happen. And so he's just pointing out to him, you're not going to get the land today. So just remember, your descendants are coming back here, but they're not going to get this land just now. And in the ensuing scriptures, we have the tract of land that God is going to give him. And so he lays out the tract of land that he's telling him that he's going to be able to have. Verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Canaanites, Kenezerites. I'm sorry about the words and the names. I'm lousy on that. Kedemonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. And we see in this particular case, from time to time, someone is going to be a smart aleck and they're going to say, well, Israel never reigned in peace over this period, over this land. But we see that they did. I believe it's in 2 Kings, 4th chapter, that they point out the fact that Solomon reigns peacefully, and he gives them the exact tract that is mentioned here. And so we see that God fulfills his prophecy. God fulfills his promise. Any other questions we might have? Any observations? Yes? Sure.
Because of his creation, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, even though he had to build miraculous gifts, even before that, they should have known, right?
Sure. They should have. But point out that Paul says they willingly ignore them.
Because you don't understand, because although they knew God, they did not glorify God.
Right. And so there's a lot of people, and then what does he say there in Romans, the first chapter, about his wrath is against whom? Who is the subject of God's wrath? Yeah, but there's some and ungodly ones. They stand in the way of your knowing about God. They make it their purpose to make sure that you don't know about God. And so that's one of the things about it, that if you take a look, uh, let's read it. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress. And so there's no excuse for a person not to know that he exists, but there are people who are making it their purpose to make it so that it's difficult for you to believe that there is a God. They are suppressing it. They will try to raise doubt in your mind. And that's exactly what has happened, especially in Abram's day. How many of those people in Abram's day know about God? Why don't they know about God? Because they've suppressed the knowledge of God. They do not desire to know him. They're exchanging his glory for that of the world. And so the people in Abram's day do not know God. They're worshiping. Do you know what the religion was in the day of Abram? Who were they worshiping? What were they worshiping in the day of Abram? And was Abram a part of that crowd? That's right. He started out in Ur. The people of that day were idolaters. They worshiped anything. In one case, they found a piece of wood that they surmised fell from heaven. So they made a god out of it, and they started worshiping that piece of wood. So they're willingly ignoring and not keeping the knowledge of God in their reason. Melchizedek knew of God. Right, and so apparently Melchizedek had people who were worshiping with him. He was a priest, but we don't know exactly, because we know that some of the patriarchs of that day followed God, but the majority of the people at this time were not God-fearing people. They were all idolatrous in one way or another. And so God is trying to share with them. And when we get further into this, what is the amazing thing to them, especially when Joseph interprets the dream of Pharaoh? What is the amazement that we have about Pharaoh when Joseph interprets his dream? Let's pay attention to Joseph's God. Yeah, his God is greater. Through him, his God interpreted my dream. Nobody else was able to interpret my dream. God, his God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, interpreted my dream. And this is one of the things that we're going to be looking at, and what I've tried to point out to us as we get a little bit further along is that when God comes to Moses, how does he identify himself? I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so many times we see that God is identified, or the faith of the righteous people are those who are following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what God do you and I follow? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is, through the Holy Spirit, the author of the Bible. You'd think so, that's for sure. We are. So what we know is that God is vying for attention with the idols of Abram's day. God is vying, get that word, he's vying for the attention of the people so that they can come to him and recognize that he does exist. And he's going to be doing that through Abram and his descendants. So the rest of the world, they have their own gods. They have the various worships that they have, and we'll see throughout the Bible, but we're not going to study everything. What I want us to do is just follow the line to Jesus. And that's my whole point, is follow the line to Jesus. Because Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise that God gave to Abraham. And we want to make sure that we don't get boggled down by some of the other events that take place. For example, we're going to see the circumcision to be administered. We don't need to be boggled down with that. We're going to see the law of Moses and the tabernacle and the worship of Moses. We don't want to get boggled down with that. We want to follow the line. And Jesus is the promise. And Jesus obviously is a part of the circumcision. He's a part of the worship of Moses and through the tabernacle. But that's not what made him the Christ. That is not what made him the Christ. And that's the point we're going to be making as we go along a little bit further. Any questions about that? So God, at this point in Abram's day and in his time, is vying for his interest, is vying for his faith, and is trying and making Abraham come to the point where he believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and his God. And so he believed something that got him out of Ur of Chaldee. He believed something when God said to him, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And bless the nations. Through your seed, I'm going to bless the nations. I get a little bit caught up in my thoughts here. But anyway, he's vying for that. Somehow, some way, he's going to get Abraham to the point where he believes, as the Hebrew writer writes in the 11th chapter, how that Abraham, even though he's been told to offer his son as a sacrifice, Abraham's going to do it. And why is he going to do it? Because God successfully wins him over, and he believes that Isaac is going to be that child that God is going to make his promise come true. And if I even have to go ahead and crucify him, God's going to raise him up again from the dead. He had faith. And that's what God was working on, getting Abraham to believe him. Now we see that Abraham does believe him. But we see that Abraham had faith in him, belief in him, when he started saying, I don't have a child yet. And God says, look at the stars. And then Abraham looks at the stars, and God says, he doesn't even have a child yet. That's where your descendants are going to be. Abraham believed him. And because he believed him, he credited it as righteousness to him. And we'll see that Abraham's faith gets bigger and stronger, and God keeps right on crediting him with righteousness. No matter where he is in his walk of faith, he believes so much that God credits him as righteousness. And then we'll see where his faith really gets big, doesn't it? When he brings himself to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. God is vying for his faith. And what is Abraham faced with? These people's faith, I seem to be the only one. But he wins him over, doesn't he? And that's what he's wanting to do with us. That's what he's wanting to do with the nation, Israel. Because when we see Israel being carried away into Babylon, where's their faith in God? Now we see every once in a while their faith is great. The question is, where is their faith? When they're being brought out of Egypt, they have some faith until they get to the river. Then all of a sudden, that faith starts to waver. And it isn't until the water is spread and they're able to cross over on the other side that their faith is renewed. But when they start facing the future, and as they start looking out over into the wilderness, the Shekinah starts to fail. Shekinah is God's image, it's God's, I got great faith in God. And then all of a sudden, it dims, glimmers. And that's exactly what Paul's writing about as far as Moses putting a mask over his face so that they can't see it fade on him. He wants to keep their faith intact, up high. I get high in my faith. I get high, and I walk around thinking, oh boy, I can do anything through the strength that God gives me. And I can. But something along the way causes that to diminish, does it not? Well, I can tell you many times. I've had Bible classes at nursing homes and been there, and I get so excited like I am right now. And I'm so excited that I know that everything is going to be fine. And then when I walk out of the nursing home, I'm faced with reality. Will my car start? Oh man, you talk about walking on a cloud. I can walk on a cloud. But anyway, he's vying for the faith of God, or for the faith of Abraham. But he's also vying for the faith of you and me, of mankind. So when Israel gets out into the wilderness, this is one of the problems that God faces, is that they don't believe in him anymore. They're starting to look after other gods, because they're not the only ones who came out of Egypt. Many hanger-ons, I call them hanger-ons, came out with the Israelites, crossed the Red Sea with the Israelites. They were there, but they brought with them, and probably some of the Israelites did too, their gods, the gods of Egypt, the gods that those people worshipped. And so as we see these things, God is vying for yours and my faith. And he's doing it through signs, wonders, and miracles. And he's going to be doing it through prophecies. He's going to be doing it with Jesus and Jesus' resurrection. Because not only does God prove that Jesus is telling the truth through the resurrection, but he also demonstrates the fact that he is. And that Jesus, in his prayer found in John, says, I glorified you. I tried my level best to glorify you. I glorified you in every way that I could. What does that mean? Jesus tried his level best to win people over to the fact that God exists. And so when Jesus predicted that he was going to be in the grave 3 days and that he was going to come forth, he was predicting what God was going to do for him. And when God did it, people should be able to say, he does exist. Jesus isn't just talking. He isn't just preaching. He's really telling us the truth. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. And that's one of the things we need to recognize along the way. Any other questions? Appreciate that comment. Got me off on chasing rabbits. But it kept me on track though, because I want us to know that God is vying for yours and my interests. He's vying for us, and he's wanting it.
That's a little bit like why the Jews did not believe in Jesus concerning the prophecies about him. Prophesied to be born in Bethlehem, when not he had children. Prophesied to be down on the cross. You know, there's two others that died with him. But when they happened to the same person, and more than one prophecy, one right after another, then you have to believe.
Exactly. You keep that thought in mind, because I'm going to build on that. That's an excellent thought, and I want you to keep that in mind, because as we look at these things, the prophecies is very important, and so is circumcision. Circumcision is very important because it keeps our mind focused on a group of people, a nation. And this is the nation that's supposed to produce that Christ. This is the group of people that's supposed to produce that Christ. And so how do we know that this is a nation? Circumcision. How many people are circumcised at that time? Basically just the believers of Judaism. Because Abraham is supposed to start circumcising all his children, right? He circumcises Ishmael. Ishmael's supposed to circumcise his children. Do you suppose that he continued circumcising? I don't know. That's a good question. But we see that Moses, when he starts to lead the people out of Egypt, his children aren't circumcised. And God isn't going to move Israel out of Egypt until Moses' two boys are circumcised. He's not going to let him do it. So circumcision is not something that is universally practiced, and circumcision today does not have the same connotation that it did back in those days, and especially during World War II. So circumcision has a big part in this. So when God implements the practice of circumcision, and we're going to see that in the next couple of chapters here, that it has a purpose, but it's not to take our minds off of the promise that God gave to Abraham. It has a purpose, and it's going to serve its purpose. The Mosaical law and the worship that comes with it has a purpose. It serves a purpose, but it's not to take the place of the promise that God gave to Abraham concerning Jesus. Jesus grew up in it. Jesus observed it. But so as we make that observation. So much for your attention. Thank you so much. I appreciate the things that got me off. It got me off target, but thank you so much for your attention.